The smell hit me first. Motor oil, dust, and something else I couldn't identify. Something that made my stomach clench with dread. I stood in the doorway of Marcus's garage, clutching the handle of an empty cardboard box, staring at 23 years of organized chaos. Tool pegboards lined the walls, labeled bins stacked to the ceiling, and his workbench sat exactly as he'd left it 3 weeks ago, before the heart attack took him away from me forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should have been grieving. I should have been sitting in our living room surrounded by casseroles from neighbors and sympathy cards that said all the right words, but felt hollow as empty promises. Instead, I was here because Victoria Hartwell, my deceased husband's mother, had given me exactly 48 hours to clean out that disaster of a workspace before she hired someone to haul everything to the dump. Marcus was always a pack rat, she'd said over the phone that morning, her voice crisp with the authority she'd wielded over her son for 47 years. No point in keeping junk that serves no purpose. The realtor needs to show the house this weekend. The house. Our house. The one Marcus and I had poured our savings into. The one where we'd planned to grow old together. The one that apparently now belonged to someone else entirely. But that's getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I got here. Standing in a garage that smelled like broken dreams, holding a box that felt heavier than grief itself. The morning Marcus died started like any other Tuesday in Riverside. February air carried the scent of orange blossoms from the grove behind our neighborhood, and the California sun filtered through our bedroom curtains in golden stripes that made everything look softer than it really was. Marcus had been up since 5, tinkering in his garage as usual, probably organizing screws by size or testing some gadget he'd ordered online. That garage was his sanctuary, his escape from the corporate consulting world that had slowly been crushing his spirit for the past decade. I remember hearing the clang of metal against concrete around 6:30, then silence. Not the comfortable silence of someone absorbed in their work, but the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl with instinct. I called his name, no answer. I called again, louder this time, and when he still didn't respond, I threw on my robe and rushed outside. I found him collapsed beside his workbench, face gray, breath coming in shallow gasps. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but those minutes stretched like hours. They worked on him in our driveway while neighbors gathered on their porches, whispering behind cupped hands. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought me a sweater. Someone else called Nicole, my best friend from college, who now lived across town. At Riverside General, the doctors used words like massive myocardial infarction and extensive damage, and did everything we could. They were kind but clinical, the way people become when death is part of their daily routine. Marcus never regained consciousness. One moment he was my husband of 23 years, and the next he was a memory I wasn't ready to carry alone. The funeral arrangements became a blur of paperwork and decisions I wasn't equipped to make. Victoria arrived from Phoenix the day after Marcus died, sweeping into Peaceful Gardens Memorial like she owned the place. She'd always been formidable, silver hair perfectly styled, shoulders squared with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. But that day, there was something different about her. Something predatory. "Claire, dear," she said, not bothering with a hug or even a gentle touch on my arm. "We need to discuss arrangements. The house, Marcus's affairs, the division of assets. There's quite a bit to sort through." I stared at her, still wearing the same black dress I'd put on that morning without really thinking about it. "Division of assets? Victoria, Marcus just died yesterday. Can't this wait?" Her smile was thin, practiced. "Grief doesn't stop time, unfortunately, and there are legal considerations we need to address immediately. Marcus never updated his will after your marriage. You know, everything reverts to next of kin." The words hit me like cold water. "What do you mean, never updated his will?" "Exactly what I said. His will was drafted when he was 25, long before he met you. In the eyes of the law, his assets including the house belong to his estate, which means they belong to his family, his real family." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that Marcus would never have left me with nothing. But the truth was, we'd never talked about wills or inheritance. We were in our 40s, healthy, planning for retirement vacations and grandchildren we hoped to have someday. Death felt like a distant concern, something for other people to worry about. "I'm sure there's been some mistake," I managed to say. "Marcus loved that house. We renovated it together. Love doesn't change legal documents. Claire, I've already spoken with Marcus's attorney, Miss Patterson, Richard Patterson, not your neighbor, confirmed that the will stands as written. The house, the cars, the bank accounts, even that ridiculous garage workshop of his, all of it belongs to the estate." The room seemed to tilt sideways. I gripped the edge of the funeral director's desk, trying to steady myself. "You're saying I have no claim to anything?" "Nothing at all." Victoria's expression softened just enough to seem sympathetic to anyone watching. "You'll be provided for, of course. There will be a small settlement, enough to get you back on your feet, but the house needs to be sold quickly. The market is good right now, and frankly, maintaining a property that size is expensive. It's better for everyone if we handle this efficiently." Like Marcus's entire life could be reduced to a real estate transaction. "I need time," I whispered. "I need time to think, to understand what's happening." "Of course, dear. Take all the time you need. But I'm afraid the house showing is scheduled for this weekend, so we'll need you to clear out your personal belongings by Friday. And that garage, well, that's just going to have to be emptied entirely." 23 years of accumulated junk isn't exactly a selling point. That's how I found myself standing in Marcus's garage 3 days later, holding an empty box and trying to figure out how to dismantle a lifetime of shared memories in 48 hours. The garage was enormous, a 2-car space that Marcus had converted into his personal kingdom years before I met him. He'd installed custom shelving, a proper workbench with built-in drawers, and enough electrical outlets to power a small factory. Every tool had its place, every project had its designated area. It was the kind of organized chaos that made perfect sense to him and absolutely none to me. I started with the obvious things: the lawnmower, the leaf blower, boxes of Christmas decorations that we'd stored out there because our house didn't have an attic. But as I worked my way deeper into the space, I began to see patterns I'd never noticed before. Marcus hadn't just been storing tools and seasonal items, he'd been documenting things. There were file folders tucked between paint cans, labeled in his precise handwriting: "House repairs 2019, insurance claims, warranty information." I pulled out the house repairs folder and flipped through it, expecting to find receipts for the new gutters or the kitchen faucet he'd replaced last spring. Instead, I found something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a copy of our marriage certificate, but not just any copy. This one had been notarized and attached to a legal document I'd never seen before. The header read, "Amendment to Last Will and Testament," in bold letters, and below that, in Marcus's careful signature, a statement that made my heart race. "In the event of my death, I hereby designate my wife, Claire Elizabeth Hartwell, as the sole beneficiary of all assets currently held in my name, including but not limited to the family residence at 247 Maple Street, Riverside, California, and all personal property contained there. This amendment supersedes all previous testamentary documents and serves as my final wishes regarding the disposition of my estate." The document was dated just 6 months ago, notarized by someone named Patricia Mills at Peaceful Gardens Memorial, and witnessed by 2 signatures I didn't recognize. My hands were shaking as I read it again, making sure I hadn't misunderstood. Marcus had updated his will. He'd made sure I would be taken care of, and somehow Victoria either didn't know about it, or was deliberately hiding it from me. I sat down hard on Marcus's rolling stool, the document still clutched in my trembling fingers. Why would Victoria lie about the will? Why would she let me believe I had no legal right to our home, our life together? And why would she be in such a hurry to sell the house if she knew this document existed? The answer came to me slowly, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Victoria hadn't been planning to sell the house. She'd been planning to keep it, maybe move back to California from Phoenix, maybe turn it into a rental property, maybe just hold on to it out of spite. But whatever her plan, it required me to be out of the picture entirely. If I didn't know about the updated will, I couldn't contest the original one. I would take whatever small settlement she offered and disappear quietly, grateful for whatever scraps the family threw my way. but now I knew, and everything was about to change. I carefully folded the document and slipped it into my purse, then continued searching through Marcus's files with renewed energy. If he'd hidden one important document in the garage, there might be others. I pulled out folders labeled insurance, investments, and legal documents, spreading them across his workbench like evidence in a detective story. What I found in those folders painted a picture of a man who'd been far more careful and far more suspicious than I'd ever realized. There were copies of every major financial document we'd ever signed, including the mortgage papers that clearly showed both our names as co-owners of the house. There were insurance policies that named me as the primary beneficiary, investment accounts that required both signatures to access, and even a folder labeled Mom that contained years of correspondence I'd never seen. The letters in the Mom folder were eye-opening. Victoria had been pressuring Marcus to divorce me for years, claiming I was holding him back and preventing him from reaching his potential. She'd offered to pay for the divorce attorney, suggested he move back to Phoenix, where she could help him get back on his feet, and even gone so far as to research California's community property laws to determine how much money he might lose in a settlement. Marcus's responses were patient, but firm. He loved me, he wrote. He was happy with our life in Riverside. He appreciated her concern but didn't need her help managing his finances or his marriage. The last letter in the folder was dated just 8 months ago, and it was different from the others. Marcus's tone was sharper, more direct. Mom, it read, I need you to understand something clearly. Claire is my wife and my partner. She will always come first in my life, and she will always be provided for in the event of my death. I've taken steps to ensure that my wishes are legally protected, and I strongly advise you not to interfere with those arrangements. I love you, but I will not tolerate any attempts to undermine my marriage or my decisions regarding my estate. Please respect that boundary. I sat back, stunned. Marcus had known. He'd known that Victoria would try to cut me out, and he'd prepared for it. The updated will wasn't just a precaution, it was a direct response to his mother's interference. He'd been protecting me, even before he knew he needed protection. But if Marcus had been so careful about documenting everything, why hadn't he told me about the will? Why hadn't he warned me about what Victoria might try to do? I thought back to our conversations over the past year, looking for clues I might have missed. Marcus had been stressed about work, worried about his health, distant in ways I'd attributed to midlife concerns. Had he been carrying this burden alone, trying to shield me from his mother's manipulation, while still ensuring I'd be safe if something happened to him? The sound of car doors slamming outside jolted me back to the present. I glanced through the garage window and saw Victoria's rental car in our driveway, along with a white van I didn't recognize. 2 men in work clothes were climbing out of the van, stretching their backs, and looking around like they were assessing a job site. Victoria appeared at the garage door moments later, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. Behind her was a thin man in an expensive suit, carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of smile that promised nothing good. Claire, dear, Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I hope you're making progress. This is Mr. Peterson from Estate Service. He's here to help facilitate the removal of Marcus's belongings. Mr. Peterson stepped forward, extending a manicured hand. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm sorry for your loss. We'll try to make this process as painless as possible. Our team can have everything cleared out within a few hours, and we'll dispose of anything that doesn't have obvious value. I stood up slowly, slipping Marcus's folders back into their places on the shelf. That's very kind, but I'm not finished going through everything yet. There might be important documents mixed in with his tools. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Oh, I'm sure anything truly important would have been kept in the house, not out here in this dusty old garage. Marcus was always leaving junk in the most inappropriate place. Really, Claire, there's no need to torture yourself going through every rusty bolt and broken gadget. Let the professionals handle it. I appreciate the offer, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, but I'd prefer to handle Marcus's things myself. It's important to me. Mr. Peterson consulted his clipboard. I understand the sentimental value, Mrs. Hartwell, but we're working on a tight timeline here. The property needs to be show-ready by tomorrow evening, and frankly this space needs significant cleaning before it can be presented to potential buyers. Tomorrow evening, I turned to Victoria, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. You said I had until Friday. Plans change, dear. The realtor had a cancellation, and weekend showings are always more effective. You understand. I understood perfectly. Victoria was accelerating the timeline because she sensed I was getting too close to some. She wanted me out of the garage before I could discover whatever else Marcus might have hidden among his tools and files. The question was whether she knew about the will amendment, or if she was just being cautious. I need more time, I said firmly. At least until Friday as we originally agreed. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. I'm afraid that's not possible. My team is only available today, and frankly the estate has already paid for our service. If you'd like to salvage a few personal items, you're welcome to do that while we work, but the bulk of this material really does need to go. The two workers had moved closer during our conversation, and I realized they weren't waiting for permission, they were waiting for instruction. Victoria had already made the decision. They were going to clear out the garage, whether I cooperated or not. You can't do this, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. This is still my home. Marcus just died 3 weeks ago. You can't just storm in here and throw away his belongings like they're garbage. Victoria's mask of sympathy finally slipped. Actually, Claire, I can. This house belongs to Marcus's estate, which means it belongs to me as his next of kin. You're living here by my grace, and that grace has limits. Now you can either work with Mr. Peterson's team to salvage whatever trinkets you'd like to keep, or you can step aside and let them do their job. But this garage is being cleared today. I looked around at Marcus's carefully organized workspace, at the file folders that contained evidence of Victoria's lies, at the lifetime of memories she was about to dump into a garbage truck. Something inside me shifted, hardened into resolve I didn't know I possessed. Fine, I said quietly, but I'm taking his files, all of them. Victoria shrugged. Take whatever you like, dear. Paper is worthless anyway. If only she knew what was written on that paper, I thought as I began gathering folders from the shelf. If only she knew that her carefully orchestrated plan was about to crumble around her perfectly manicured feet. I filled 3 boxes with Marcus's documentation, working quickly while the estate service team began dismantling his workbench. Victoria supervised from the doorway, checking her watch every few minutes, like she had somewhere more important to be. When I carried the last box to my car, she followed me outside. I want you to know, she said, her voice softer now, almost gentle, that this isn't personal, Claire. You're a lovely woman, and Marcus was happy with you, but life moves on, and holding on to the past doesn't help anyone. The settlement I've arranged will give you enough money to start fresh somewhere new, maybe closer to your own family, a smaller place, easier to maintain. You'll see in a few months, you'll realize this was all for the best. I locked the boxes in my trunk and turned to face her. Victoria was shorter than me by several inches, but she carried herself with the kind of authority that made her seem larger than life. For 23 years, she'd intimidated me into silence, made me feel like an outsider in my own marriage, convinced me that I wasn't good enough for her son. But standing there in my driveway, holding the keys to evidence that would destroy her lies, I felt something I'd never felt in Victoria Hartwell's presence. I felt powerful. You're right, I said calmly. Life does move on, and I'm looking forward to seeing where mine goes from here.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She smiled, satisfied that she'd finally gotten through to me. I knew you'd be reasonable. Mr. Peterson will finish up here, and then we can discuss the settlement details. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by my generosity. I nodded, and walked back toward the house, leaving her standing in the driveway with her clipboard-carrying accomplice and his team of garbage collectors. But instead of going inside, I circled around to the side yard where I could watch the garage through a gap in the fence. I needed to see what they did with Marcus's belongings, needed to know if there were other secrets hidden among the tools and equipment I hadn't had time to search. For the next 2 hours, I watched them load Marcus's life into the back of their truck, his woodworking tools, the ones he'd inherited from his grandfather, the vintage motorcycle he'd been restoring for 15 years, boxes of electronic components from his consulting days, some of which were probably worth thousands of dollars. Victoria supervised it all with the detached efficiency of someone discarding unwanted furniture. When they finally drove away, the garage stood empty except for oil stains on the concrete floor and holes in the pegboard walls where Marcus's tools had hung. Victoria locked the side door and headed for her rental car, probably planning to celebrate her victory with dinner at some expensive restaurant. She had no idea that her victory was about to become the greatest defeat of her life. I waited until her car disappeared around the corner, then pulled out my phone and called Nicole Rodriguez. Nicole had been my college roommate, my maid of honor, and now one of the most successful estate attorneys in Riverside County. If anyone could help me understand the legal implications of what I'd found, it was her. "Claire?" Nicole's voice was warm with concern. "How are you holding up, honey? I've been thinking about you constantly since the funeral." "Nicole?" I said, my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "I need your help, and I need it now." Nicole arrived at my house within an hour carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of focused expression that had made her legendary in Riverside's legal community. She'd changed since our college days. Her wild curls were now tamed into a professional chignon, and her vintage band t-shirts had been replaced by tailored blazers. But her eyes still held the same fierce intelligence that had helped her graduate summa cum laude, while the rest of us were still figuring out our major. "Show me everything," she said without preamble, settling herself at my kitchen table like she was preparing for battle. I spread Marcus's files across the surface, watching Nicole's expression shift from sympathetic concern to sharp professional interest as she examined the document. She studied the will amendment first, holding it up to the light, checking the notarization, examining the witness signatures with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen too many fraudulent documents in her career. "This is legitimate," she said finally, setting the paper down with careful precision. "The notarization is proper, the witness signatures appear genuine, and the language is legally sound. More importantly, it's recent enough to supersede any previous testamentary document." She looked up at me, her expression grim. "Claire, if Victoria knew about this amendment, what she's doing constitutes fraud. If she didn't know about it, she's about to be very, very surprised." "What are the chances she knows?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Nicole pulled out the correspondence between Marcus and his mother, scanning through the letters with increasing intensity. "Based on this final letter from Marcus, I'd say she absolutely knows. Look at this phrase here. I've taken steps to ensure that my wishes are legally protected." That's not subtle, he was warning her directly. She continued reading, occasionally making notes on a legal pad she'd pulled from her briefcase. The afternoon light was fading outside my kitchen window, casting long shadows across the table where the evidence of Victoria's deception lay scattered like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Finally clicking into place. "Here's what I think happened," Nicole said, leaning back in her chair. "Victoria knew Marcus had updated his will, but she was betting you didn't know about it. Her plan was to present you with the old will, convince you that you had no legal rights, and pressure you into accepting whatever settlement she offered. Once you signed away your claims to the estate, the updated will would become irrelevant because you'd have voluntarily relinquished your rights. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. She was going to let me believe Marcus had abandoned me, that 23 years of marriage meant nothing to him. Worse than that, she was going to profit from your grief and your ignorance. If you'd signed her settlement agreement, she would have gained control of assets worth easily $500,000. Maybe more depending on the current market value of this house. Nicole stood up and walked to my kitchen window, staring out at the driveway where Victoria's rental car had been parked just hours earlier. "The question now is, how do you want to handle this? We could file a petition with the probate court, present the amended will, and seek immediate recognition of your rights as the sole beneficiary. It's straightforward, it's legal, and Victoria wouldn't have a leg to stand on." But I could hear the hesitation in her voice. "But that approach is reactive. It puts you in the position of having to prove your case, and it gives Victoria time to mount a defense. She could claim the amendment was forged, or that Marcus was mentally incompetent when he signed it, or any number of other defenses that would drag this out for months." She turned back to face me, and I saw something calculating in her expression that reminded me of why she'd never lost a case in her 12 years of practice. There's another option. A more proactive approach. I'm listening. We let Victoria think her plan is work. We let her believe you're going to sign the settlement agreement. But before you do, we set up a meeting with all parties present. Victoria, her attorney if she has one, you, me, and preferably a court reporter to document everything. Then, when she presents her fraudulent claims about the will, we present the real one. The idea sent a thrill of anticipation through my chest. You want to ambush her. I want to give her enough rope to hang her. If we can get her on record making false statements about the will, claiming she didn't know about the amendment, presenting fraudulent documents, that's not just civil fraud, Claire. That could be criminal. I thought about Victoria's smug satisfaction as she'd supervised the destruction of Marcus's workshop, the casual cruelty with which she'd dismissed 23 years of my marriage, the way she'd tried to make me grateful for whatever scraps she decided to throw my way. The woman who'd spent years trying to convince my husband that I wasn't good enough for him was about to learn exactly what I was capable of. Do it, Nicole smiled, and for a moment, she looked exactly like the 20-year-old girl who'd talked her way out of parking tickets and convinced professors to extend deadlines through sheer force of personality. I was hoping you'd say that. We spent the next 2 hours planning our strategy. Nicole would contact Victoria's attorney, the Mr. Patterson she'd mentioned, and arrange a settlement conference for the following week. She'd present it as a routine meeting to finalize the estate distribution, something that would seem perfectly normal from Victoria's perspective. In the meantime, I would continue to play the role of the grieving widow who was grateful for any assistance the family could provide. The key, Nicole explained, is to let her commit fully to her version of events before we reveal what we know. We need her to go on record claiming that Marcus never updated his will, that you have no legal rights to the estate, that she's being generous by offering you any settlement at all. The more lies she tells, the stronger our case becomes. After Nicole left, I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the documents that would either vindicate me or destroy Victoria's credibility forever. The house felt different now, not like a place I was about to lose, but like a fortress I was preparing to defend. Marcus's presence seemed stronger somehow, as if he were standing beside me, finally ready to confront the woman who'd spent decades trying to control his life. I called Victoria that evening, putting on my most subdued voice. Victoria, it's Claire. I wanted to thank you for your patience today. I know this is difficult for everyone. Her response was warm, almost maternal. Of course, dear. I understand how overwhelming this must be for you. Grief makes everything harder. I've been thinking about what you said, about starting fresh somewhere new. Maybe you're right. Maybe holding on to the house isn't the best thing for me right now. There was a pause and I could practically hear Victoria's satisfaction radiating through the phone. I'm so glad you're being sensible about this, Claire. I know it's not easy, but sometimes the kindest thing we can do for ourselves is let go of the past. I'd like to meet with your attorney, Mr. Patterson, to discuss the settlement details. Would that be possible? Absolutely. I'll call him first thing tomorrow morning. Sure, we can arrange something for early next week. And Claire, I want you to know that I'll make sure you're well taken care of. Marcus would have wanted that. The hypocrisy of it was breathtaking. Marcus would have wanted me to inherit everything he'd worked for, everything we'd built together. He'd made that crystal clear in both his amended will and his correspondence with his mother. But Victoria was so convinced of her own righteousness that she could twist his memory to justify stealing from his widow. Thank you, I managed to say. That means more than you know. We're family, dear. That's what family does for each other. After I hung up, I poured myself a glass of Marcus's favorite wine, a bottle we'd been saving for our 25th anniversary that would never come, and toasted the empty kitchen. Here's to family, I said aloud, and I swear I could feel Marcus laughing somewhere in the shadow. The weekend passed in a strange state of suspended animation. I spent Saturday cleaning the house, not because Victoria had demanded it, but because I needed something to do with my hands, while my mind raced through all the possible ways our confrontation could unfold. Sunday I drove to Peaceful Gardens Memorial and sat beside Marcus's grave, telling him about the documents I'd found, about Nicole's plan, about the justice that was finally coming for his interfering mother. I wish you could be there to see her face, I whispered to the granite headstone that bore his name, and the dates that bracketed a life cut too short. But maybe you will be. Maybe you'll be watching from wherever you are now, finally free from her manipulation. The wind rustled through the oak trees that shaded the cemetery, and I chose to interpret it as approval. Monday morning brought a call from Nicole. "It's set," she said, her voice crackling with anticipation. Wednesday afternoon, 2 o'clock at Patterson's office downtown. Victoria will be there, along with Mr. Peterson from the estate service company. I told Patterson we wanted to discuss the settlement terms and finalize the property transfer. "What did you tell him about me?" "That you're a reasonable woman who understands the legal realities of the situation and wants to resolve everything amicably," which, in a way, is absolutely true. I spent Tuesday morning at the Riverside County Clerk's office, making certified copies of every document in Marcus's file. Nicole had explained that we needed multiple originals in case Victoria or her attorney tried to claim our evidence was fraudulent. I also stopped by Pacific Neurology Center, where Marcus had been treated for stress-related headaches in the months before his death. Harrison, his neurologist, was happy to provide a letter confirming that Marcus had shown no signs of cognitive impairment or mental instability during their sessions. "Your husband was sharp as a tack," Dr. Harrison told me as he signed the letter. "Stressed about work, worried about his mother's constant interference in his marriage, but mentally sound in every respect. He mentioned updating his will, actually, said he wanted to make sure you were protected if anything happened to him. One more piece of evidence. One more nail in Victoria's coffin." Wednesday arrived gray and drizzly, typical February weather in Southern California. I dressed carefully, conservative black suit, minimal jewelry, the kind of outfit that would reinforce Victoria's impression of me as a meek widow, grateful for whatever crumbs she decided to scatter. Nicole met me in the parking garage beneath Patterson's office building, looking every inch the formidable attorney in her charcoal gray power suit and briefcase that probably cost more than my car. "You ready for this?" she asked as we rode the elevator to the 15th floor. "I've been ready for 23 years, I replied, and I meant it. The law offices of Patterson, Michaels and Associates occupied half the floor, all marble and mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered sweeping views of the San Bernardino Mountain. The receptionist, a polished young woman who probably earned more in a month than I'd made in a year as a freelance interior designer, directed us to a conference room where Victoria was already holding court. She'd dressed for the occasion too, navy blue Chanel suit, pearl earrings, hair styled to perfection. Beside her sat a man I assumed was Mr. Patterson, silver-haired and distinguished in the way that only came from decades of expensive legal education and billable hours. Miss Tipperson from the estate service was there as well, looking uncomfortable in a chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Claire, dear," Victoria rose to embrace me, the picture of a caring mother-in-law shepherding her son's widow through a difficult time. "You look lovely. Grief suits you, strangely enough." The comment was so casually cruel that I almost broke character, but Nicole's hand on my arm reminded me to stay focused. We were here to let Victoria dig her own grave, not to score petty points. Mr. Patterson stood as well, extending a firm handshake. "Miss Hartwell, my condolences on your loss. I understand you're interested in reaching an amicable settlement regarding your late husband's estate. Thank you for arranging this meeting," I said softly. "I just want to understand my options." Patterson gestured for everyone to take their seats around the polished conference table. He opened a file folder and withdrew several documents, spreading them before us with the ceremonial gravity of a priest laying out communion elements. "The situation is quite straightforward," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his pronouncements accepted without question. "Mr. Marcus Hartwell died intestate, that is, without a valid will, which means his estate is subject to California's intestate succession laws. As his surviving mother and primary next of kin, Mrs. Victoria Hartwell is entitled to the bulk of his assets." I forced myself to look confused. "I thought spouses inherited automatically." Patterson's smile was patronizing. "That's a common misconception. Without a will specifically naming you as a beneficiary, your claim is limited to what the law defines as a surviving spouse's share. Given that the marriage produced no children and lasted less than 25 years, that share is quite modest." Victoria leaned forward, her expression carefully calculated to convey reluctant generosity. "Of course, we want to do right by you, Claire. You made Marcus happy and that means something to our family, which is why I'm prepared to offer you a settlement that goes well beyond what the law requires." She slid a document across the table toward me. $50,000, plus the proceeds from Marcus's life insurance policy, which I believe totals another $30,000. That should be more than enough to help you start fresh. I stared at the settlement agreement, letting my hands tremble slightly as I read through the terms. $80,000 in exchange for relinquishing all claims to an estate worth at least 10 times that amount. The house alone was worth $400,000, not to mention Marcus's retirement accounts, his consulting business assets, and the vintage motorcycle Victoria had hauled away like scrap metal. "This is very generous," I said quietly. "More than I expected." Victoria's smile was triumphant. "I'm glad you understand. I know this is difficult, but sometimes the kindest thing we can do is accept reality and move forward." "Before we proceed," Nicole interjected smoothly, "I'd like to clarify a few details for my client's protection. Mr. Patterson, you mentioned that Miss Hartwell died intestate. I assume you've conducted a thorough search for any testamentary documents." Patterson nodded confidently. "Of course, I've been the Hartwell family attorney for over 20 years. I drafted Marcus's original will when he was 25, and I can confirm that no subsequent documents were ever filed with this office." "And you're certain that Mr. Hartwell never executed any amendments or codicils to that original will?" "Absolutely certain. If such documents existed, they would have been prepared by this office and kept in our files." Victoria chimed in, her voice carrying the ring of absolute conviction. "Marcus was never much for paperwork, I'm afraid. He always said he trusted the law to take care of things properly. It never occurred to him that he might die so young." Nicole made a note on her legal pad, her expression neutral. "I see, and Mrs. Victoria Hartwell, you're stating for the record that you have no knowledge of any attempts by your son to modify his testamentary dispositions?" "None whatsoever. If Marcus had updated his will, he certainly would have told me. We discussed financial matters quite openly." More lies, each one digging Victoria deeper into the hole she was creating for herself. I glanced at Miss Peterson, who was fidgeting with his pen and looking like he wished he were anywhere else. The estate service representative clearly had no idea he was witnessing what amounted to a legal fraud in progress. "And the property at 127 Maple Street?" Nicole continued. "I understand Miss Claire Hartwell's name appears on the deed as a joint tenant with right of survivorship." Patterson waved dismissively. "A technicality. The property was purchased during the marriage using funds from Marcus's inheritance, which means it remains part of his separate estate despite the joint tenancy designation." That was news to me. Marcus had never mentioned using inheritance money to buy our house. We'd both contributed to the down payment from our savings, and I'd been making the mortgage payments for the past 2 years while his consulting business struggled. But I kept my expression carefully neutral, letting Patterson continue his fabrication. "In any case," Victoria added, "the house is far too large and expensive for Claire to maintain on her own. Selling it and using the proceeds to help settle the estate is really the most practical solution for everyone involved." Nicole nodded thoughtfully. "I can see the logic in that approach. However, before my client signs any agreements, I do have one final question. Are you absolutely certain, Mrs. Victoria Hartwell, that no will or testament executed by your son after the year 2001 exists anywhere in his personal effects or among his papers?" Victoria's eyes flashed with irritation at the repeated questioning. "I've already answered that. Marcus never updated his will. He never even mentioned updating his will. The idea simply never occurred to him. And you, Miss Patterson, are you willing to state under oath that no testamentary documents dated after 2001 exist in relation to Marcus Hartwell's estate?" Patterson's confidence was absolute. "I would stake my professional reputation on it." Nicole smiled, and I recognized the expression from our college days. The look she got right before she demolished an opponent in debate class. "In that case, I think it's time we clarified a few facts." She opened her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder, placing it on the table with deliberate ceremony. "This is a certified copy of a document titled Amendment to Last Will and Testament, executed by Marcus Edward Hartwell on August 15th of last year. It's notarized, properly witnessed, and legally filed with the Riverside County Clerk's Office. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's face went white, then red, then white again. Patterson reached for the document with shaking hands, his confidence evaporating like morning mist. Patterson looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. "This is impossible," Patterson stammered, scanning the amendment with growing horror. "If this document existed, I would have been contacted." The filing requirements were fulfilled completely. Nicole interrupted. "As you can see from the clerk's stamp, this amendment was properly filed and recorded. The notarization was performed by Patricia Mills at Peaceful Gardens Memorial, and the witnesses were Dr. James Harrison of Pacific Neurology Center and Sarah Chen, a paralegal from Mills & Associates downtown." Victoria found her voice at last, though it came out as more of a croak. "This is a forgery. It has to be. Marcus would never have done this without telling me." Nicole reached into her briefcase again, withdrawing a second folder. "These are copies of correspondence between your son and yourself, dating back 3 years. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to a letter dated December 10th of last year, in which Marcus explicitly states that he has taken steps to ensure that his wishes are legally protected, and strongly advises you not to interfere with those arrangements." She placed the letter directly in front of Victoria, who stared at it like it was a poisonous snake. The handwriting was unmistakably Marcus's, and the content left no room for interpretation. Victoria had known about the will amendment, and she'd proceeded with her fraudulent scheme anyway. Furthermore, Nicole continued, her voice gaining strength as she built her case, "We have medical records from Dr. Harrison confirming that Marcus showed no signs of mental impairment or cognitive decline in the months before his death. We have bank records showing that Miss Claire Hartwell has been solely responsible for the mortgage payments on the Maple Street property for the past 2 years, and we have documentation proving that the house was purchased using jointly held funds, not inheritance money as Mr. Patterson claimed." Patterson was frantically flipping through his files, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "There must be some mistake. I never received notice of this amendment. The proper procedures were followed to the letter," Nicole said firmly. "The amendment specifically states that notification to previous counsel was not required, as Mr. Hartwell was exercising his right to update his testamentary dispositions independently." Victoria finally found her voice, though it was high and shaky with barely controlled rage. "This is outrageous. Even if this document is genuine, it doesn't prove anything. Marcus was under tremendous stress in his final months. His judgment was compromised. He was being manipulated by—" She gestured wildly in my direction. "This whole marriage was a mistake, and everyone knew it." "Are you suggesting," Nicole asked quietly, "that Mrs. Claire Hartwell somehow coerced your son into updating his will? Because if so, I'd be very interested to hear your evidence for that claim." The trap was closing, and Victoria knew it. Any claim of undue influence would require proof that Marcus was mentally incompetent or under duress when he signed the amendment. But the medical records showed he was in full possession of his faculties, and his correspondence with Victoria proved he was acting of his own free will in direct opposition to her wishes. "I want this meeting terminated," Victoria said, standing abruptly. "I need time to consult with independent counsel." "Of course," Nicole agreed pleasantly. "But before you go, I should mention that we'll be filing a petition with the probate court tomorrow morning, seeking immediate recognition of the amended will and requesting a full investigation into any attempts to defraud the estate. We'll also be providing copies of today's transcripts to the district attorney's office, as some of the statements made here may constitute criminal fraud." Patterson was gathering his papers with the frantic energy of a man whose professional reputation was circling the drain. "There's been a misunderstanding. My client was acting on incomplete information. If we'd known about the amendment, you would have done exactly what you're doing now," Nicole finished, "trying to cover up the fact that you presented false claims to a grieving widow in an attempt to defraud her of her rightful inheritance." Victoria was already at the door, her perfect composure finally cracking. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I won't let some nobody destroy my son's legacy." "Your son's legacy," I said, speaking for the first time since Nicole had begun her presentation, is safe with me, which is exactly what he wanted. The door slammed behind Victoria with enough force to rattle the window. Patterson followed a moment later, mumbling apologies and promises to rectify the situation. Mr. Peterson lingered just long enough to assure Nicole that his company would return any of Marcus's belongings that could be recovered from their storage facility. When the conference room finally emptied, Nicole and I sat in the sudden silence, surrounded by the documents that had just destroyed Victoria's carefully constructed lie. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the mountains looked purple in the afternoon light, beautiful and eternal and completely indifferent to the human drama that had just unfolded in their shadow. Well, Nicole said finally, that went better than I expected. I started laughing then, and once I started, I couldn't stop. It was the kind of laughter that comes from relief and vindication, and the sudden understanding that justice actually exists in the world, even when it takes its time arriving. Marcus would have loved every moment of what we'd just accomplished. His mother, the woman who'd spent decades trying to control his life, had finally been held accountable for her actions. What happens now? I asked when I could finally speak again. Now we file the paperwork to officially probate the amended will. The house is yours. The bank accounts are yours. Everything Marcus wanted you to have is yours. Victoria can contest it if she wants, but she doesn't have a legal leg to stand on. More importantly, the statements she made today could land her in serious legal trouble if the DA decides to pursue charges. I thought about Victoria driving back to her hotel, probably already on the phone with some expensive criminal defense attorney, finally facing consequences for a lifetime of manipulation and control. The woman who'd dismissed me as a nobody had just learned exactly what this nobody was capable of when pushed too far. Thank you, I said to Nicole, meaning it more than she could possibly know. Thank Marcus, she replied. He's the one who made sure you'd be protected. I just helped you understand what he'd already given you. As we rode the elevator down to the parking garage, I felt something shifting inside me, some fundamental change in how I saw myself and my place in the world. For 23 years, I'd let Victoria make me feel small, insignificant, unworthy of her son's love. But Marcus had seen something different in me, something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. And now, finally, I was beginning to see it too. The phone calls started that evening. Victoria's voice, when I finally answered on the fifth ring, was ice-cold fury barely contained by years of practiced social grace. You think you're very clever, don't you? She said without preamble. But this isn't finished, Claire. Not by a long shot. I was sitting in Marcus's favorite armchair, the one Victoria had criticized as shabby during her last visit, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold while I stared at the empty garage through the kitchen window. The space looked violated somehow, stripped of everything that had made it Marcus's sanctuary. But knowing what I knew now about the documents he'd hidden there, I understood that the garage had served its purpose. It had protected his final gift to me, until I was ready to claim it. Hello, Victoria, I said calmly. I was wondering when you'd call. Don't you dare take that tone with me. I don't know what kind of legal trickery you and that lawyer friend of yours pulled today, but I won't stand for it. Marcus was my son long before he was your husband. The possessiveness in her voice was breathtaking. Even in death, she couldn't let him go, couldn't accept that he'd chosen to build a life separate from her suffocating control. He was your son, I agreed, but he was also a grown man who made his own decisions about his life and his legacy. His legacy? Victoria's laugh was bitter. His legacy is being destroyed by a woman who never understood him, never deserved him, never contributed anything meaningful to his success. You were just along for the ride, Claire, a placeholder until someone better came along. The words should have hurt. For 23 years, they would have sent me spiraling into self-doubt and recrimination. But sitting there in Marcus's chair, surrounded by the life we'd built together, I felt nothing but pity for this woman who'd spent so much energy trying to diminish everyone around her. If that's what you need to believe, I said quietly. But the legal documents suggest Marcus saw things differently. Those documents prove nothing, except that you manipulated a grieving, stressed man into making decisions he would never have made in his right mind. I have emails, Claire, evidence of the pressure you put on him in his final month. The way you isolated him from his family, turned him against the people who actually cared about his well-being. This was new information, and it sent a chill down my spine. What emails could Victoria possibly have? Marcus and I had shared everything, or so I'd thought. Had he been communicating with his mother behind my back, complaining about our marriage, expressing doubts about our relationship? I don't know what you're talking about, I said, though I could hear the uncertainty creeping into my voice. Don't you? We'll see about that when this goes to court. Because it is going to court, Claire. I'm going to contest that fraudulent will, and I'm going to prove that you coerced my son into signing away his birthright. When I'm finished with you, you'll be lucky to walk away with anything at all. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone, and wondering if Victoria actually had evidence I didn't know about, or if she was simply bluffing, trying to shake my confidence the way she'd been doing for over 2 decades. Either way, her threat was clear. The battle was far from over. I called Nicole immediately, reaching her at home, where she was helping her teenage daughter with calculus homework. The domestic normalcy of her situation, patient explanations of derivatives punctuated by teenage sighs, felt surreal after the intensity of our afternoon confrontation. She's rattled, Nicole said after I'd relayed Victoria's threats. People don't make desperate phone calls when they're confident in their legal position, but we should take her seriously about having additional evidence. I'll file a discovery motion tomorrow, requesting access to any correspondence between Marcus and his mother that she plans to introduce in court. What if she actually has something damaging? What if there are emails where Marcus expressed doubts about the will, or about our marriage? Nicole's voice was reassuring but realistic. Then we'll deal with it. But remember, Claire, even if Marcus had momentary doubts or frustrations, and what spouse doesn't, that doesn't invalidate a legally executed will. The standard for proving undue influence is extremely high. Victoria would need to show that you systematically isolated Marcus from his support system, that you exerted psychological pressure specifically related to the will amendment, and that Marcus was in a diminished mental state when he signed the document. She paused, and I could hear her daughter groaning about asymptotes in the background. The medical records we have show he was mentally sound. The correspondence shows he was acting against his mother's wishes, not yours. And the timing of the will amendment, 6 months before his death when he was healthy and working normally, makes it very difficult to argue coercion. After we hung up, I wandered through the house that was now legally mine, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just the place where Marcus and I had lived together, it was the symbol of everything he'd wanted to preserve and protect. Every room held evidence of the life we'd built, photo albums chronicling 23 years of anniversaries and vacations, and quiet Sunday morning bookshelves where our reading tastes had gradually merged until we couldn't remember who'd originally owned which volumes, a kitchen where we'd learned to cook together and argued about proper knife techniques, and shared countless bottles of wine while discussing our day. Victoria saw all of this as an obstacle to her control over Marcus's legacy, but Marcus had seen it as the legacy itself, not the money or the property, but the love and partnership and shared dreams that had made those assets meaningful. The will amendment wasn't just about ensuring I'd be financially secure, it was about preserving the world we'd created together. I spent the evening going through Marcus's home office, looking for any evidence of the emails Victoria had mentioned. His computer was password protected, but I knew his passwords, our anniversary date, our dog's name, variations on themes that mattered to both of us. The search through his email archives revealed the usual correspondence, work-related messages, confirmations for dinner reservations, exchanges with college friends about fantasy football leagues. But buried in a folder labeled personal were emails I'd never seen before. Messages between Marcus and his mother stretching back 3 years, a parallel conversation that had been happening alongside our marriage without my knowledge. I opened the earliest ones with trembling fingers, afraid of what I might find. The first few emails were innocuous enough, Victoria sharing news about her life in Phoenix, Marcus responding with polite updates about work and our home renovations. But as I read chronologically forward, I could see the pattern emerging. Victoria's messages became increasingly critical of our lifestyle, our financial decisions, our choice to remain in California rather than moving closer to her. She questioned our decision not to have children, suggested that I was holding Marcus back from pursuing better career opportunities, and repeatedly invited him to visit Phoenix alone for family time. Marcus's responses were patient but firm. He defended our choices, explained that we were happy with our life in Riverside, and gently redirected Victoria's attempts to criticize me, but I could see the toll these conversations were taking on him. His messages became shorter, more stilted, less frequent over time. The most recent emails from the months before Marcus's death were more troubling. Victoria had become increasingly direct in her criticism of our marriage, suggesting that I was unstable and manipulative, and that Marcus deserved better. She'd sent articles about divorce law in California, information about property division, even contact information for divorce attorneys she claimed were discreet and effective. Marcus's final email to his mother, sent just 2 weeks before his death, was unlike anything else in their correspondence. Gone was the patient, diplomatic tone he'd maintained for years. Instead, his message was sharp and unambiguous. "Mom, I need you to I've tried to be patient with your concerns about my marriage, but this has gone too far. Claire is my wife and my partner. She's stood by me through business failures, health scares and family drama that would have driven most people away. She's the best thing that ever happened to me, and I will not tolerate any more attempts to undermine our relationship. I've updated my will to ensure that Claire is protected if anything happens to me. This decision is final and non-negotiable. If you cannot respect my marriage and my choices, then perhaps we need to take a break from communicating until you can find a way to be supportive rather than destructive. I love you, but I love Claire more, and I'm tired of pretending that's going to change." I stared at the screen, tears blurring my vision. Marcus had been fighting this battle for years, protecting our marriage from his mother's interference, while trying to maintain some relationship with her. The stress of managing Victoria's constant criticism and manipulation must have been enormous, yet he'd never burdened me with the full extent of her campaign against our relationship. But there was something else in these emails that worried me. Victoria's messages in the final weeks before Marcus's death showed an escalation in her tactics. She'd started questioning his mental health, suggesting that the stress of his failing business was affecting his judgment, hinting that he might need professional help or family intervention. If she could use these emails to support a claim that Marcus was mentally unstable when he updated his will, she might have a stronger case than Nicole had anticipated. I printed copies of the entire email chain and called Nicole again, despite the late hour. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been expecting my call. "I found the emails," I said without preamble, "and they're both better and worse than I expected. Send them to me now," Nicole said. "I'll review them tonight and call you first thing in the morning." While I waited for her assessment, I continued searching through Marcus's files, both digital and physical. In a folder labeled Financial Planning, I found correspondence with an estate attorney I'd never heard of, someone Marcus had consulted about updating his will but ultimately decided not to use. The attorney's notes, carbon copied to Marcus, revealed that he'd been concerned about potential family challenges to any will that excluded his mother from significant inheritance. "Given your mother's history of interference in your personal decisions," the attorney had written, "I would recommend extreme care in executing any testamentary documents. Consider using multiple witnesses who can testify to your mental state and decision-making capacity at the time of signing. Also consider documenting your reasons for the disposition of assets in a separate letter that can be presented if the will is contested." Marcus had clearly taken this advice to heart. The will amendment had been witnessed by his doctor and a paralegal, both of whom could testify to his mental acuity, and somewhere among his papers, there might be additional documentation explaining his decisions. I resumed my search with renewed urgency. I found what I was looking for in the last place I thought to look, taped to the bottom of a drawer in Marcus's desk, a sealed envelope with my name written in his careful handwriting. Inside was a letter dated the same day he'd signed the will amendment, a message he'd never intended me to read, unless Victoria challenged his final wishes. "My dearest Claire," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means my mother has done exactly what I feared she would do. She's probably told you that I never loved you enough to provide for you, that our marriage was somehow less legitimate than her relationship with me, that you don't deserve the life we built together. I need you to know that none of that is true. You have been the greatest joy of my life from the moment we met. You've made me a better man, a happier man, a man who finally understood what it meant to be part of a real partnership. Everything I've achieved, everything I've become, has been possible because you believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. My mother has never understood this. She sees love as possession, family as hierarchy, relationships as competitions, to be won or lost. She cannot comprehend that choosing you was not a rejection of her, but an affirmation of the man I wanted to be. She cannot accept that the greatest gift she could give me is to support my happiness rather than trying to control it. I've updated my will because I want you to have everything we built together, not because you need it. You're strong enough to take care of yourself, and we both know it, but because these assets represent our shared dreams, our mutual efforts, our combined hopes for the future. They belong with you because you helped create them, and because you'll honor what they represent in ways she never could. If she's challenging the will, it's not because she needs the money, or because she has any legitimate claim to our life together. It's because she cannot bear the thought that I chose you over her, that I loved you more than I feared her disapproval, that I built something beautiful with you that existed completely outside her control. Don't let her make you doubt what we have. Don't let her convince you that you were anything less than the center of my world. Fight for what we built together, not because you have to prove anything to her, but because preserving our legacy is the greatest gift you can give to the memory of our love. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more deserving of happiness than you've ever allowed yourself to imagine. I wish I could be there to remind you of these truths, but since I can't, let this letter serve as my final testimony to the woman who made my life complete. All my love, always and forever. Marcus, I cried then, sitting alone in Marcus's office at nearly midnight, holding the letter that proved beyond any doubt how much he'd loved me and how well he'd understood the battle I would face after his death. But these weren't tears of grief or despair. They were tears of gratitude for a man who'd loved me enough to anticipate my struggles and arm me with the weapons I'd need to fight them. Nicole called at 7 the next morning, her voice energized by caffeine and purpose. I've been up all night reviewing those emails, and I have good news. Victoria's correspondence actually strengthens our case rather than weakening it. How is that possible? Some of those messages make it sound like Marcus was mentally unstable. That's exactly the problem with Victoria's position. The emails show a clear pattern of her attempting to undermine Marcus's mental health and marriage stability, not documenting actual evidence of either. When you contrast her claims with the medical records showing Marcus was mentally sound, and with his own responses defending you and your relationship, it becomes obvious that she was the one creating stress and instability in his life. Nicole's analysis was thorough and reassuring. The emails demonstrated that Marcus had been under pressure from his mother for years, not from me. His decision to update his will wasn't the result of sudden mental incapacity or spousal manipulation. It was the culmination of a long-standing conflict between his loyalty to his mother and his commitment to his marriage. The fact that he'd chosen our marriage was evidence of his sound judgment, not proof of coercion. There's something else, Nicole continued. I've been thinking about Victoria's threat to take this to court. Given the strength of our evidence and the weakness of her position, I think she's hoping we'll panic and agree to some kind of settlement rather than face the publicity and expense of a trial. You think she's bluffing? I think she's desperate. But even if she's not bluffing, even if she files a formal challenge to the will, she's going to lose. And when she loses, she could be liable for our legal fees and possibly face sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit. The thought of Victoria facing actual consequences for her behavior was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. For so many years, she'd been able to manipulate and control the people around her without ever having to answer for the damage she caused. But the legal system, unlike family dynamics, operated on evidence and facts rather than emotional manipulation and guilt. What do we do now? I asked. We file our petition to probate the amended will and wait to see if she actually follows through on her threat. In the meantime, You should start taking steps to secure the assets that are rightfully yours. The house, the bank accounts, Marcus's business interests, all of that should be transferred into your name as quickly as possible. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of paperwork and phone calls. Nicole had filed our petition with the probate court, requesting immediate recognition of Marcus's amended will and appointment of me as executor of his estate. The process was surprisingly straightforward. The amended will was legally valid, properly executed and unambiguous in its terms. Within a week, I received official documentation confirming my status as the sole beneficiary of Marcus's estate. Victoria, meanwhile, had gone silent. No more threatening phone calls, no legal challenges filed with the court, no attempts to contact Marcus's friends or business associates to gather support for her position. It was as if she'd simply vanished, leaving behind only the wreckage of her failed attempt to steal my inheritance. But I knew better than to assume she'd given up entirely. Victoria Hartwell didn't accept defeat gracefully, and she had too much pride to simply walk away from a fight she'd started. She was planning something, regrouping for another attack, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The confirmation came 2 weeks later, not from Victoria herself but from Mr. Peterson, the estate service representative who'd been present during our disastrous settlement meeting. He called on a Thursday afternoon, his voice nervous and apologetic. "Miss Hartwell, I hope you don't mind me contacting you directly. I wanted to let you know that Mrs. Victoria Hartwell has been calling our office repeatedly asking about the items we removed from your husband's garage. She's particularly interested in whether we found any additional documents or papers among his belongings." This was troubling news. If Victoria was still searching for documents, it meant she hadn't given up on challenging the will. She was looking for evidence, anything that might contradict the amended will or support her claims about Marcus's mental state. "Did you find any other papers in the garage?" I asked. "That's the thing, Mrs. Hartwell. We did find some additional items after we'd already loaded the truck. A box of papers that had been tucked behind the water heater, probably forgotten there for years. We were going to dispose of them with the rest of the items, but Mrs. Victoria Hartwell has specifically requested that we turn them over to her instead." My heart raced. What could be in those papers that Victoria thought might help her case? And more importantly, did she have any legal right to claim them? "Mr. Peterson, those papers were part of my husband's belongings, and as the executor of his estate, I believe I have the right to examine them before they're given to anyone else." "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Mrs. Hartwell. Frankly, Miss Victoria Hartwell's behavior has been quite aggressive, and I'm not comfortable turning over estate materials to someone who isn't the legal executor. Would you be able to come to our facility to review the items? I think you should see what we found before making any decisions about disposition." I drove to the estate service facility the next morning, my mind racing with possibilities. What could Marcus have stored behind the water heater that was so important Victoria was willing to risk another confrontation to obtain it? The facility was located in an industrial area outside Riverside, a sprawling complex of warehouses and storage units that smelled of dust and motor oil. Mr. Peterson met me at the front office, looking relieved to see me. "I have to tell you, Mrs. Hartwell, your mother-in-law has been quite persistent. She's called 6 times in the past 3 days, and yesterday she showed up here in person demanding to see the materials. I had to explain that without proper legal authorization, I couldn't release estate property to anyone but the executor." He led me to a small office where a cardboard box sat on a metal desk. The box was labeled M. Hartwell Garage Storage in black marker, and through the open top I could see stacks of papers and what looked like old photographs. "This was wedged behind the water heater," Peterson explained. "Easy to miss unless you were specifically looking for it. Most of it appears to be old personal documents, maybe sentimental items your husband wanted to preserve." I pulled the first stack of papers from the box, and immediately understood why Victoria was so desperate to get her hands on these materials. They were psychiatric evaluation reports, dated from Marcus's college years, documenting a period of depression and anxiety he'd experienced during his junior year at USC. The reports mentioned family pressure, parental expectations, and difficulty establishing independence from an overly controlling mother figure. But that wasn't the most damaging material in the box. Underneath the psychiatric reports were drafts of letters Marcus had written but never sent, exploring his feelings about our relationship and his mother's constant interference. Some of these drafts were brutally honest about the stress he'd been under, the pressure he'd felt to choose between his wife and his mother, the moments when he'd wondered if everyone would be happier if he just gave up and did what Victoria wanted. Taken out of context, these drafts could be devastating to our case. They showed a man who was conflicted, stressed, and occasionally doubtful about his decision. In the right hands, they could be used to argue that Marcus had been mentally unstable when he updated his will, that he'd been under psychological pressure that compromised his judgment. But I kept reading, and the full picture these documents painted was more complex than Victoria could have hoped. Yes, Marcus had struggled with depression and anxiety, but those struggles were directly linked to his mother's behavior. The psychiatric report specifically identified family boundary issues and parental enmeshment as primary factors in his emotional distress. The unsent letters, while revealing his internal conflicts, ultimately showed a man working through his feelings and consistently arriving at the same conclusion: his life was better with me in it, regardless of what his mother thought. The final document in the box was a folder labeled "For Claire, Emergency Only." Inside was a handwritten note, clearly written in a moment of deep despair, that explained everything. "If something happens to me and Mom tries to make you doubt what we had together," Marcus had written, "remember that my struggles were never about you. They were about learning to love you more than I feared disappointing her. Every day of our marriage, I had to choose between making you happy and making her happy. I chose you every time, and I never regretted it. Don't let her use my worst moments to erase our best one." I sat back in the metal chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions Marcus had been carrying throughout our marriage. He'd been fighting a battle I'd only partially understood, protecting our relationship from his mother's influence while simultaneously wrestling with years of psychological conditioning that made it difficult for him to disappoint her. But he'd done it day after day, year after year. He'd chosen our marriage over his mother's approval. The will amendment wasn't an aberration or a moment of weakness. It was the final definitive statement in a long campaign to establish his independence and protect what we'd built together. "Mrs. Hartwell." Peterson's voice brought me back to the present. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's perfect," I said, carefully placing the documents back in the box. "I'll be taking these with me, and I want to make it clear that no one else has any claim to these materials." "Of course." "What should I tell Mrs. Victoria Hartwell if she calls again?" I thought about Victoria, probably sitting in her Phoenix home right now, planning her next move, convinced that these documents would give her the ammunition she needed to destroy my case. She had no idea that Marcus had anticipated this moment, that he'd left me not just legal protection but emotional armor as well. "Tell her," I said, lifting the box and heading for the door, "that she's too late." The call came 3 days later, just as I was beginning to think Victoria had finally accepted defeat. Nicole's voice was tight with controlled anger when she delivered the news. "She's filed a formal challenge to the will," Nicole said without preamble. "Not just the amendment. She's challenging Marcus's mental capacity to execute any testamentary documents in the final year of his life. She's claiming he was suffering from severe depression and anxiety that compromised his decision-making ability." I was standing in my kitchen, looking out at the empty garage where this whole nightmare had started. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, highlighting dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. "She found a way to use the psychiatric reports," I said, not really surprised. "How did you know about?" Nicole stopped herself. "Never mind. We need to meet immediately. Victoria's attorney has submitted what appears to be a comprehensive psychological profile suggesting Marcus was mentally unstable for months before his death. If they can establish that pattern, they might be able to invalidate both the amended will and any other legal documents he executed during that period." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Victoria succeeded in proving Marcus was mentally incompetent, she wouldn't just inherit his estate, she'd be able to challenge every decision we'd made together in his final month. The joint bank accounts, the insurance beneficiaries, even the mortgage refinancing that had kept us afloat during his business struggles, everything could be unwound, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back and 23 years of memories she'd probably try to steal as well. "What do we need to do?" I asked. "We fight back, hard. I'm calling an emergency hearing for next week, and we're going to present every piece of evidence we have that Marcus was thinking clearly when he updated his will. The medical records from Dr. Harrison, the business correspondence from his final months, testimony from friends and colleagues who interacted with him regularly. After Nicole hung up, I sat alone in the silence of my kitchen, trying to process the magnitude of what Victoria was attempting. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about rewriting the entire narrative of Marcus's life and our marriage. She was trying to paint him as a mentally ill man who'd been manipulated by a scheming wife, erasing the reality of our partnership and reducing our love story to a cautionary tale about predatory women and vulnerable men. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Victoria was willing to destroy her own son's reputation, to have him declared mentally incompetent in official court records, just to prevent me from inheriting what he'd wanted me to have. She'd rather see Marcus remembered as a broken man than accept that he'd chosen to build a life that didn't revolve around her. But I had weapons she didn't know about. The box of documents from Peterson's storage facility was sitting in my dining room, and the materials inside told a story very different from the one Victoria was trying to construct. Yes, Marcus had struggled with depression and anxiety, but those struggles were directly connected to his mother's behavior, not to any inherent mental illness or inability to make rational decisions. I spent the afternoon organizing every piece of evidence we had, creating a timeline that would demonstrate Marcus's mental acuity and decision-making capacity throughout the period in question. His business correspondence showed clear, rational thinking. His personal emails revealed a man wrestling with difficult family dynamics, but ultimately making thoughtful choices about his priorities and values. The psychiatric reports from his college years actually supported our case, documenting how his mental health had improved dramatically once he'd established distance from his mother's controlling influence. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. Nicole spent the intervening days preparing our counter-argument, interviewing witnesses who could testify to Marcus's mental state, and consulting with psychiatric experts who could explain the difference between situational stress and cognitive impairment. Meanwhile, Victoria had assembled her own team of experts. Through the discovery process, we learned she'd hired a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in testamentary capacity cases, expensive professionals who made their living convincing courts that wills should be invalidated based on mental health concerns. She'd also retained a private investigator who'd been digging into Marcus's medical history, looking for any evidence of prescription drug use or therapy sessions that might support claims of mental instability. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the house Marcus and I had shared, touching the furniture we'd picked out together, looking at photos from vacations we'd taken, remembering conversations we'd had about our future plans. Everything felt fragile, temporary, as if Victoria's legal challenge could retroactively erase the reality of our life together. I ended up in Marcus's office, sitting at his desk where he'd written the letter explaining his decision to update his will. On impulse, I opened his computer and navigated to the folder containing his correspondence with Victoria. Reading through their emails again, I was struck by how clearly they documented the progression of their relationship from strained but cordial to openly hostile. But there was something else in those emails I hadn't noticed before, a pattern of escalation on Victoria's part that suggested she'd been planning this legal challenge for months before Marcus's death. Her messages about his mental health, her suggestions that he needed professional help, her attempts to gather evidence of his instability, all of it had been laying the groundwork for exactly the kind of case she was now pursuing. In one email dated just 6 weeks before Marcus's death, Victoria had written, "I'm concerned about your emotional state, honey. You seem so different lately, so distant and angry. Have you considered speaking with someone professional about these changes? I've researched some excellent psychiatrists in the Riverside area who specialize in adult depression and anxiety disorders. I'd be happy to help you make an appointment." Marcus's response had been brief and pointed. "I'm not depressed, Mom. I'm tired of pretending that your constant criticism of my marriage and my choices doesn't affect me. The only thing that would improve my emotional state is if you could find a way to be supportive instead of destructive." This exchange perfectly illustrated the dynamic between them. Victoria created stress and conflict, then pointed to Marcus's reactions as evidence that he was mentally unstable. She was manufacturing the very problems she claimed to be concerned about, then using his responses to support her narrative of decline and incompetence. The hearing took place in a sterile courtroom that smelled of floor polish and old paper. Judge Martinez, a stern woman in her 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes, presided over the proceedings with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who'd heard every possible variation of family greed, disguised as concern. Victoria had dressed for the occasion in a conservative black suit that made her look like the grieving mother she was pretending to be. Her attorney, a silver-haired man named Reynolds who specialized in will contests, had arranged his evidence with theatrical precision: medical files, expert reports, and enlarged photographs of the psychiatric evaluations from Marcus's college year. "Your Honor," Reynolds began, his voice heavy with practiced sympathy, "this case is not about greed or family disputes. It's about protecting the memory and final wishes of a troubled young man who was not in his right mind when he made critical decisions about his estate." He painted a picture of Marcus as a victim, first of his own mental illness, then of a wife who'd taken advantage of his vulnerability to secure her financial future. According to Reynolds's version of events, the will amendment was just the latest in a series of questionable decisions Marcus had made under psychological duress, influenced by a woman who'd isolated him from his family and exploited his fragile emotional state. "The evidence will show," Reynolds continued, "that Mr. Hartwell was suffering from severe depression and anxiety in the months before his death. He was under tremendous stress from business failures, struggling with prescription medication dependencies, and exhibiting clear signs of cognitive decline that rendered him incapable of making rational decisions about his estate." It was a masterful performance, delivered with just the right mixture of legal authority and emotional manipulation. "If I hadn't known the truth about Marcus's relationship with his mother, I might have been convinced by Reynolds's portrayal of a concerned family trying to protect a vulnerable man from exploitation. But then Nicole stood up, and I remembered why she'd never lost a case in 12 years of practice." "Your Honor," Nicole said, her voice calm and confident, "the petitioner's case relies on a fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between situational stress and mental incapacity." "Yes, Mr. Hartwell was under stress in his final months, specifically stress created by his mother's relentless campaign to undermine his marriage and control his personal decisions." Nicole methodically dismantled Victoria's case, piece by piece. The psychiatric reports from Marcus's college years showed improvement, not decline, once he'd established boundaries with his controlling family. The business correspondence, from his final months, demonstrated clear thinking and rational decision-making. The medical records from Dr. Harrison showed no signs of cognitive impairment or prescription drug abuse. Most damaging to Victoria's case was Marcus's own correspondence with his mother. Nicole presented the emails chronologically, showing how Victoria had systematically tried to create doubt about Marcus's mental health and stability, then used his defensive responses as evidence of the very problems she was manufacturing. "These emails reveal a troubling pattern," Nicole told the court. "The petitioner repeatedly suggested that her son needed psychiatric help, questioned his judgment and decision-making capacity, and attempted to gather evidence of mental instability. When he responded with understandable frustration to these attacks on his competence and his marriage, she pointed to his reactions as proof that her concerns were justified." The testimony phase of the hearing was where Victoria's case completely collapsed. Dr. Harrison took the stand to confirm that Marcus had shown no signs of cognitive decline or mental illness during their session. Marcus's business partner testified that he'd been sharp and focused during their final meetings, discussing long-term strategic plans and making sound financial decisions. But the most devastating witness was Patricia Mills, the funeral director who'd notarized Marcus's will amendment. She testified that Marcus had been calm, coherent, and clearly focused when he'd signed the document. More importantly, she revealed that Marcus had specifically requested that the amendment be processed quickly because he was concerned about potential family challenges to his estate planning. "Mr. Hartwell told me he wanted to make sure his wife would be protected if anything happened to him," Mills testified. "He said his mother had been pressuring him to make changes to his estate plan, and he wanted to ensure that his actual wishes were legally documented and enforceable." Victoria's own expert witness, the forensic psychiatrist she'd hired to support her case, proved to be her undoing. Under cross-examination, Nicole forced him to admit that he'd never met Marcus, had no first-hand knowledge of his mental state, and was basing his opinions entirely on selected documents provided by Victoria's legal team. Dr. Nicole said, "You've testified that Ms. Hartwell was suffering from severe depression that would have impaired his decision-making capacity. Can you point to any specific instance where this alleged depression manifested in poor judgment or irrational behavior?" The psychiatrist struggled to provide concrete examples. He pointed to Marcus's business failures, but Nicole countered with evidence that those failures were due to market conditions, not poor decision-making. He mentioned Marcus's expressions of frustration in emails to his mother, but Nicole demonstrated that those reactions were proportionate responses to Victoria's provocative behavior. In fact, Dr. Nicole continued, "Isn't it true that the ability to recognize and respond appropriately to toxic family dynamics actually demonstrates good judgment and emotional intelligence?" By the time the psychiatrist stepped down, Victoria's case was in ruins, but Nicole wasn't finished. "She called me to the stand to testify about my marriage to Marcus, our shared decision-making processes, and his mental state in the months before his death." Facing Victoria across the courtroom while describing my relationship with her son was one of the most difficult things I'd ever done. She stared at me with unconcealed hatred, her perfect composure finally cracking, as I described how happy Marcus had been in our marriage, how excited he'd been about our retirement plans, how proud he'd been of the life we'd built together. "Miss Hartwell," Nicole asked, "in your 23 years of marriage, did you ever witness any signs that your husband was mentally incapable of making important decisions?" "Never," I said firmly. "Marcus was one of the most thoughtful, deliberate people I've ever known. He researched every major decision we made, from buying cars to choosing vacation destinations. He would never have updated his will without careful consideration of all the implications." "And did he ever express concerns about his mother's potential reaction to his estate planning decision?" I glanced at Victoria, who was gripping the edge of the defendant's table so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Yes, he was worried that she would try to challenge his will if something happened to him. That's why he was so careful to follow proper legal procedures and document his reason." The final blow came when Nicole presented Marcus's letter to me, the one he'd hidden in his desk drawer, explaining his decision to update his will and anticipating exactly the kind of challenge Victoria was now mounting. This letter, Nicole told the court, was written on the same day Mr. Hartwell executed his will amendment. It demonstrates not only his mental clarity and rational thinking, but also his accurate prediction of the family dynamics that would unfold after his death. Judge Martinez read the letter in silence, her expression growing more skeptical as she absorbed Marcus's words about his mother's controlling behavior and his determination to protect our marriage from her interference. When she finished reading, the judge looked directly at Victoria. "Miss Hartwell, I want to be very clear about something. The evidence presented in this courtroom suggests that your son was not mentally incompetent when he updated his will. Rather, it suggests that he was responding rationally to what he perceived as threats to his marriage and his autonomy." Victoria started to speak, but Judge Martinez held up a hand to stop her. "Furthermore, the court is troubled by evidence suggesting that you may have deliberately attempted to create doubts about your son's mental capacity in order to support this legal challenge. That kind of behavior is not only unethical, it's potentially criminal." The judge's ruling was swift and unambiguous. Marcus's will amendment was valid, executed by a mentally competent adult who understood the consequences of his decision. Victoria's challenge was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she could never raise these issues again in court. Moreover, Judge Martinez ordered Victoria to pay our legal fees and issued a warning that any further attempts to harass me or challenge the estate would result in contempt of court charges. But the most satisfying moment came when Judge Martinez addressed Victoria directly about her conduct throughout the proceedings. "Mrs. Hartwell," the judge said, her voice cold with disapproval, "your son's letter makes it clear that he loved his wife and wanted to provide for her after his death. Your attempts to subvert his clearly expressed wishes by manufacturing evidence of mental incompetence constitute an assault on his memory and his autonomy. This court will not be a party to your efforts to rewrite your son's legacy to serve your own purposes." Victoria sat in stunned silence as the judge delivered her ruling, the reality of her complete defeat finally sinking in. Reynolds gathered his papers with the resigned efficiency of a lawyer who'd just lost a case he'd thought was unwinnable, while Victoria stared straight ahead as if she couldn't quite believe what had happened. As we filed out of the courtroom, Victoria made one last attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her case. She approached me in the hallway, her voice low and venomous. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You may have won in court, but you'll never escape what you've done. Marcus deserved better than you, and deep down you know it." For 23 years, words like these would have sent me spiraling into self-doubt and recrimination. But standing there in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by the evidence of Marcus's love and protection, I felt nothing but pity for this bitter woman who'd spent so much energy trying to destroy the happiness she couldn't understand. "You're right," I said quietly. "Marcus did deserve better. He deserved a mother who supported his choices instead of undermining them. He deserved a family who celebrated his happiness instead of trying to sabotage it. He deserved to live without constantly having to choose between the woman he loved and the woman who claimed to love him." Victoria's face went white with rage. "How dare you?" "I dare because he gave me the strength to dare," I interrupted. "Every document we presented in that courtroom, every piece of evidence that proved his mental competence and his love for me, he left all of that for me to find. He knew exactly what you would try to do, and he made sure I'd have the weapons to fight back." I stepped closer to Victoria, close enough to see the defeat in her eyes despite her defiant posture. "Marcus spent 23 years trying to build a bridge between his love for me and his loyalty to you. You spent those same 23 years trying to burn that bridge down. Congratulations, you finally succeeded. But the only thing you burned was your relationship with your son, and now it's too late to rebuild it." Victoria turned and walked away without another word, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to her final exit from my life. I watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The woman who'd tormented my marriage for over 2 decades was finally powerless to hurt me. But the victory felt hollow because it had come at such a terrible cost. Nicole appeared at my side, having finished her conversation with the court clerk about the final paperwork. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I'm free," I said, and for the first time in months, I truly meant it. For the first time since Marcus died, I'm actually free. We walked out of the courthouse together into the bright California sunshine. The mountains in the distance were purple with afternoon shadows, and the air carried the scent of orange blossoms from the groves outside the city. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, but something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of myself and my place in the world. "What happens now?" Nicole asked as we reached our cars. "Now I go home," I said. "To my house, to my life, to the future Marcus wanted me to have, and I try to figure out how to honor his memory by actually living that future instead of just surviving it." Nicole smiled, the expression transforming her professional demeanor back into the college roommate who'd helped me through countless crises over the years. "If you need anything, legal advice, moral support, a bottle of wine and someone to tell you how amazing you are, you know where to find me." After she drove away, I sat in my car for a long time, looking back at the courthouse where I'd just won the most important battle of my life. Victoria was gone, defeated and powerless to hurt me anymore. The house was mine, the money was mine, the freedom to grieve and heal and rebuild was finally mine. Marcus's final gift had been not just financial security, but liberation from the fear and intimidation that had shadowed our entire marriage. But as I drove home through the familiar streets of Riverside, past the coffee shop where Marcus and I had shared Sunday mornings, and the park where we'd walked our dog every evening, I realized that winning the legal battle was just the beginning. The real challenge would be learning how to live without the woman who'd defined herself in opposition to Victoria's disapproval, how to build an identity that wasn't shaped by the need to prove my worth to someone who would never accept me. For 23 years, I'd been Marcus's wife in spite of his mother's objections. Now I had to figure out how to be myself without that familiar framework of resistance and defiance. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely overwhelming all at once. As I pulled into my driveway, at my house which no one could ever take away from me again, I saw something that stopped my heart. There was a car parked across the street, a familiar rental sedan with Phoenix plates. Victoria hadn't left town. She was still watching, still lurking, still unable to accept that her power over my life had finally ended. But this time, instead of fear or anger, I felt something that surprised me: compassion. Victoria was a 70-year-old woman who'd just lost her son and her lawsuit and probably her sense of identity all at once. She was sitting in a rental car outside the house where she'd never be welcome again, clinging to the last vestiges of a control she'd never really possessed. I got out of my car and walked directly to her window. She rolled it down slowly, her face a mask of exhaustion and defeat. "Victoria," I said gently, "it's time for you to go home." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't know how," she whispered. "The same way you got here," I replied. "1 mile at a time, 1 day at a time. Marcus is gone, and fighting over his memory won't bring him back. But you can still choose how you want to remember him: as the son who disappointed you, or as the man who found happiness despite your best efforts to prevent it." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. She began to cry, not the theatrical tears she'd shed in court, but the raw, ugly sobs of a woman who'd finally run out of ways to avoid confronting her own failures. "I loved him," she managed to say between sobs. "I just wanted what was best for him." "I know," I said, "and I did. But what you thought was best and what actually made him happy were two different things. It's not too late to accept that, even if it's too late to fix it." I left her crying in her car and walked into my house, my sanctuary, my fortress, my... Tomorrow she would drive back to Phoenix, and I would begin the process of rebuilding my life without her shadow hanging over it. Tonight, I would sit in Marcus's chair and read his letters and remember not the battles we'd fought, but the love we'd shared, and the future he'd still given me even in death. 6 months after the courthouse victory, I stood in Marcus's garage holding a sledgehammer and wearing safety goggles that made me look ridiculous. The space that had once been his organized kingdom of tools and projects was about to become something entirely different. My art studio, complete with skylights and proper ventilation and enough room for the kind of large-scale paintings I'd dreamed about creating for years. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. For weeks after Victoria's defeat, I'd avoided the garage entirely, unable to reconcile the empty space with my memories of Marcus tinkering away in his sanctuary. The silence where his workshop sounds used to be felt like another kind of grief, harder to process than his actual death because it represented the slow erasure of his presence from our daily life. But gradually, as spring turned into summer and the legal nightmares faded into memory, I began to see the garage differently, not as a monument to loss but as a canvas for possibility. Marcus had always encouraged my artistic ambitions, the ones I'd set aside when freelance interior design work became more financially practical than pursuing gallery representation. He'd bought me expensive brushes for birthdays and subscribed to art magazines I pretended not to want, always believing in talents I'd convinced myself were too impractical to nurture. The sledgehammer felt heavy in my hands, but there was something deeply satisfying about the weight of. This wasn't destruction for its own sake, it was renovation, transformation, the physical act of creating space for the life Marcus had wanted me to build. The first swing sent a shock through my arms as the hammer connected with the pegboard where his tools had hung. Wood splintered and fell to the concrete floor in pieces that would become kindling for the fireplace he'd installed in our living room 3 winters ago. Nicole had stopped by that morning to check on my progress, both legal and emotional. The final paperwork from the estate settlement was complete, leaving me with assets worth nearly $600,000 and the freedom to do whatever I wanted with the rest of my life. She'd brought coffee and pastries from the bakery downtown, settling into one of the lawn chairs I'd dragged into the garage to serve as temporary furniture while I planned the renovation. "You know," she'd said, watching me measure wall space for the skylights I wanted to install, "6 months ago you could barely say Marcus's name without crying. Now you're gutting his workshop with power tools. That's either remarkable healing or the early stages of a complete breakdown." I'd laughed, surprising myself with how easy it came. Maybe both, but for the first time since he died, I feel like I'm moving forward instead of just surviving each day. The transformation of the garage was symbolic of something larger happening in my life. The woman who'd spent 23 years defining herself in relation to other people as Marcus's wife, as Victoria's disappointing daughter-in-law, as someone who kept the peace at any cost, was slowly discovering who she might be when those external definitions fell away. It wasn't easy. There were days when the freedom felt overwhelming, when the absence of familiar constraints left me paralyzed by too many choices. What did I want to paint? Where did I want to travel? How did I want to spend the money Marcus had left me? These were questions I'd never been forced to answer entirely for myself, and the responsibility of making purely personal decisions felt foreign and intimidating. But there were also moments of pure joy that caught me off guard. The afternoon I'd spent 3 hours painting a sunset just because the colors moved me, with no concern for whether the result was commercially viable or technically perfect. The morning I'd booked a trip to Tuscany on impulse, remembering how Marcus used to describe the light there and wanting to see it for myself. The evening I'd called my estranged sister in Portland and tentatively begun rebuilding a relationship that had withered under years of prioritizing Marcus's family drama over my own connections. The sound of a car pulling into my driveway interrupted my demolition work. Through the garage window I saw a familiar sedan, not Victoria's rental which had disappeared from my street the day after the courthouse confrontation, but Dr. Harrison's modest Honda. He'd been Marcus's neurologist, the man whose testimony had helped destroy Victoria's case, and he'd become an unexpected source of support during the difficult months of legal battles and emotional recovery. "Claire?" he called from the driveway. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I brought something I thought you might want to see." I set down the sledgehammer and walked out to meet him, pulling off my safety goggles and probably looking like I'd been through a natural disaster. Harrison was a small, neat man in his 60s with kind eyes and the patience that came from years of helping people navigate medical crises that reshaped their understanding of mortality. "I've been going through some old files," he explained, "and I found something Marcus left with me during one of our final sessions. He asked me to hold on to it and give it to you if anything happened to him, but only after you'd had time to grieve and settle his affair." He handed me a manila envelope with my name written in Marcus's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered with his neat script, dated just 2 weeks before his death. "My beloved Claire," the letter began, "if Dr. Harrison is giving you this letter, it means I'm gone and you've survived whatever storm my mother tried to create afterward. I'm writing this during what I hope will be my last visit to discuss the stress headaches, though I suspect they'll continue as long as Mom keeps pushing for me to divorce you and move back to Phoenix. Dr. Harrison has been helping me understand that the anxiety I've been experiencing isn't a sign of mental illness. It's a normal response to an abnormal situation. Living with someone who constantly questions your judgment and challenges your choices would make anyone stressed. The difference is that most people don't have to navigate that dynamic with their own mother. I want you to know that every difficult decision I made in our marriage, every time I chose you over her, every boundary I set with my family, was made with complete clarity and conviction. The will amendment wasn't a moment of weakness or confusion. It was the most important decision I ever made, because it ensures that the life we built together will continue even after I'm gone. But I don't want you to just preserve what we had. I want you to expand on it. Remember how you used to paint before we got married, how your eyes would light up when you talked about colors and textures and the way light fell across a canvas? I want you to find that passion again. Not because you have to, but because you deserve to discover what you're capable of when no one is questioning your choices or undermining your confidence. The garage has always been my space, but I've been thinking it could be yours too, someday. All those windows face north, perfect light for painting, and there's enough room for easels and storage, and maybe even space for workshops if you decide to teach other people what you've learned about creating beauty in the world. I know this sounds presumptuous, planning your future when I won't be there to share it, but I've spent months thinking about what would make me happy if our situations were reversed, if you died and left me alone with Mom's criticism, and my own doubts about whether I deserved the love we share. I think I'd want you to leave me a roadmap for rediscovering joy, a reminder that our marriage was about encouraging each other's dreams, not just surviving each other's families. So paint, my love, travel, take risks, make mistakes. Be gloriously, unapologetically yourself in ways that our life together sometimes made difficult. And when you're ready, not before, but when you're truly ready, consider sharing that light with someone new. Not as a replacement for what we had, but as evidence that you learned something valuable about love during our years together. I'm not worried about your strength. You've proven time and again that you're tougher than anyone gives you credit for, including yourself. What I worry about is your willingness to use that strength for your own happiness instead of everyone else's comfort. Promise me you'll try to be selfish sometimes, in the best possible way. All my love now and always, Marcus. P.S. Check the bottom drawer of my desk. I may have ordered a few art supplies that I was saving for your next birthday. I read the letter twice, then looked up at Dr. Harrison through tears that felt different from the grief I'd been carrying for months. These were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of the overwhelming relief that comes from being truly understood by someone who loved you enough to know exactly what you'd need to hear even after they were gone. He was worried about you, Dr. Harrison said gently. Not because he thought you were weak, but because he knew how hard it would be for you to prioritize your own needs after spending so many years managing his mother's interference. He wanted to make sure you had permission to be happy, even if he couldn't be there to remind you that you deserved it. That evening I opened the bottom drawer of Marcus's desk and found art supplies worth more than I'd ever spent on myself in a single purchase. Professional-grade paints, brushes in sizes I'd only dreamed of owning, canvases stretched and primed and ready for whatever visions I could imagine bringing to life. He'd been planning this gift for months, maybe years, waiting for the right moment to encourage me back toward the dreams I'd set aside. The first painting I created in my new studio was terrible by any objective standard. The proportions were wrong, the colors muddy, the composition chaotic in ways that reflected my emotional state more than any artistic vision, but it was mine in a way that nothing had been mine for decades. Every brushstroke was a choice I made without consulting anyone. Every color decision was based solely on what pleased me in that moment. As autumn arrived and the skylights I'd installed filled the studio with the kind of natural light Marcus had promised, I began to understand what he'd been trying to tell me in his final letter. The paintings improved as my confidence grew, but more importantly, the act of creating became a form of meditation, a way of processing not just grief but the overwhelming possibility of a future shaped entirely by my own desires and choices. I started teaching art classes on Saturday mornings, opening my studio to a small group of women who came for the same reason I'd started painting again, the need to rediscover parts of themselves that had been buried under years of other people's expectations. We painted badly at first, laughing at our mistakes and encouraging each other through the frustration of learning new skills in midlife, but gradually, magic began to happen. Sarah, a recently divorced accountant, discovered that she had an extraordinary eye for color. Margaret, whose children had finally left home after 30 years, found that she could paint landscapes that captured emotions as much as scenery. Linda, who'd been caring for her elderly mother for a decade, created abstract pieces that seemed to vibrate with the energy she'd been holding inside for too long. Watching these women transform through art reminded me of my own journey over the past year. None of us had started painting because we thought we were destined to be artists. We'd started because we needed to remember what it felt like to create something purely for the joy of creation, to make choices based on what brought us happiness rather than what others expected of us. The one-year anniversary of Marcus's death arrived on a Tuesday that felt like any other day until I realized what the date meant. I woke up in our bed, my bed now, and felt the absence of the crushing grief that had defined the previous month. It was still there, would probably always be there in some form, but it had evolved into something gentler, more integrated into the fabric of my daily life. I spent the morning painting a portrait of Marcus from memory, trying to capture not his physical features but the essence of who he'd been, the patience, the quiet strength, the way he'd looked at me like I was exactly what he'd been hoping to find in life. It wasn't a perfect likeness, but it was honest in ways that photographs couldn't be, infused with love and loss and gratitude for the time we'd shared. That afternoon, Nicole stopped by with a bottle of the wine Marcus and I had been saving for our 25th anniversary. We sat in the studio surrounded by my paintings and drank to his memory, to my survival, to the friendship that had carried me through the darkest period of my life. "He would be so proud of you," Nicole said, gesturing at the canvases that covered every available wall space. "Not just the art, though these are beautiful, but the way you fought for what he wanted you to have, the way you refused to let Victoria rewrite your story. Sometimes I still can't believe it's over," I admit. For so many years, dealing with her interference felt like a permanent part of my life. Now she's just gone, and I don't know what to do with all the energy I used to spend defending myself. "You use it for this," Nicole said, "for creating, for teaching, for building the life Marcus wanted you to have, for being gloriously, unapologetically yourself." As winter approached, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. I contacted a gallery in downtown Riverside and arranged to show some of my paintings. Not because I thought I was ready for critical acclaim or commercial success, but because sharing my art felt like the natural next step in the journey Marcus had mapped out for me in his final letter. The opening reception was small, attended mostly by my art students and their families, but it felt like a celebration of everything I'd survived and everything I was becoming. Standing in front of my paintings, explaining my artistic choices to people who seemed genuinely interested in my perspective, I felt the last vestiges of the woman who'd defined herself through other people's approval finally fall away. Near the end of the evening, a stranger approached me, a man about my age with kind eyes and paint under his fingernails, who introduced himself as David, a fellow artist who taught at the community college. We talked about technique and inspiration and the courage it took to start creating in midlife, and when he asked if I'd like to have coffee sometime to continue the conversation, I surprised myself by saying yes. Not because I was ready for a new relationship, I wasn't sure I ever would be, but because the invitation felt like proof that I'd internalized Marcus's final lesson about being open to possibility, about allowing joy back into my life when it appeared. David might become a friend, a mentor, a romantic partner, or simply a pleasant coffee companion. The important thing was that I was willing to find out, willing to risk the vulnerability that comes with letting new people see who you really are. Driving home from the gallery that night, I passed the cemetery where Marcus was buried. On impulse, I stopped and walked to his grave, carrying a small canvas I'd painted that afternoon. Wildflowers in a vase, simple and bright and full of the life he'd wanted me to embrace. "I did it," I whispered to the headstone that bore his name and the dates that bracketed our time together. "I fought for what you wanted me to have, and I won. But more than that, I'm finally learning how to want things for myself." The wind rustled through the oak trees that shaded the cemetery, and I chose to interpret it as approval, as love, as permission to continue becoming whoever I was meant to be now that the battles were over, and the future was entirely mine to create. The drive home took me past the house where we'd lived together, the garage that had become my studio, the life that had evolved from survival into something that looked surprisingly like happiness. Victoria was 3 states away, powerless to interfere with my choices. The legal battles were over, the money was mine, the freedom was real, and permanent, and sometimes overwhelming in its completeness. But for the first time since Marcus's death, that freedom felt like a gift rather than a burden. Tomorrow I would paint something new, teach my students how to trust their artistic instincts, maybe even call David to arrange that coffee. Tonight, I would sit in the studio Marcus had envisioned for me, and plan the next chapter of a story that was finally completely my own to write. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.